In commemoration of the mission of inclusion, which is close to our hearts and an ever-present action item on our community priority list, the Beth Shalom Inclusion Committee welcomes you to this event. In the spirit of inclusion, today's program is captioned and sign language interpretation is provided. Thank you to our sign language interpreter, Marianne Brown. And everyone knows our own Sandy Brewarski, an award-winning, prolific journalist, author, and editor whose work runs the gamut from interviews with Oliver Sacks to an update with the all-of-a-kind family author to truly hundreds of other works. She is prolific and her work is varied. Her most recent book is 212 Views of Central Park, Experiencing New York's Jewel from Every Angle. I'm going to turn it over to Sandy to introduce our invited guest.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. And thanks to all of you for joining us. I'm so pleased to be here this evening with Dr. Arielle Silverman. Dr. Silverman has made her life's mission to find and remove the unnecessary barriers keeping people with disabilities from reaching their full potential. So we're going to have a conversation about her important and excellent new memoir called Just Human. Arielle, I'm holding up the beautiful jacket, The Quest for Disability Wisdom, Respect, and Inclusion. It's written with insight, candor, beautiful prose, and many levels of wisdom. She writes about growing up. Arielle was born blind, and about her Jewish community, her education, romance, the obstacles she faced and overcame, her involvement with organizations for the blind, and her passionate commitment as an advocate for the disabled. The format for tonight is that I'm going to more formally introduce Arielle, and then we'll have a conversation, and we'll be happy to take your questions. You can write them through the chat, or actually later on, you can even raise your hands. It's especially nice for me to be here with Arielle because while this is the first time that we're meeting, I grew up with Arielle's mother who is joining us and knew her grandparents and great-grandparents. So very briefly, by way of introduction, Arielle Silverman is a disabled activist, social scientist, and author who is passionate about improving public understanding of life with disabilities. She grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and earned a PhD in social psychology from the University of Colorado, Boulder, and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Dr. Silverman has written more than a dozen peer-reviewed research articles on disability psychology. She now works as the director of research at the American Foundation for the Blind, mentors blind youth, and also provides inclusion consulting. Just Human is her first book, and there's information about where you can find it. We're going to put that into the chat. Arielle is joining us from her home in Alexandria, Virginia, where she lives with her husband. So welcome, Arielle.
Thank you.
Nice to be here with you. And I thought it would be great to give participants a sense of how eloquent and beautiful your writing is on the page. So I thought it would be great if you could read that short section in the first chapter where you speak about the feeling of being blind.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I do that, just for fun, I'm going to hold up, this is the Braille copy. So you guys just saw the print copy of the book a minute ago, and now I'm going to hold up the Braille copy of the book that I'll be reading from. And so this is open to the page that I'll be reading from. And believe it or not, this is only half the book. So later on, I'm going to be reading from the other half of the book. Braille is compared to printed words, brailled words take up a lot more space. So the paper is a lot thicker, and most Braille books will be embossed in more than one volume. So that just gives you a little taste of what Braille looks like. So here goes. The word blind has never bothered me any more than the word blonde. Both describe a visible characteristic of a person. Blind people can't see, and blonde people have light-colored hair. I never put much of a value judgment on either one. For me, blindness has always felt as natural as breathing. I don't long for sight any more than somebody might long for the ability to fly, an invisibility cloak, X-ray vision, or the ability to read minds. All are things we might idly dream about during life's pauses before we get back to its regularly scheduled programming. For me, sight is as exciting and mystical as any of these other superpowers, but having never had it before, it is something relegated to my imagination. In the meantime, I have found that most activities the average person does visually, I can perform quite ably using my other senses. Sometimes this requires the help of assistive devices or collaboration with others. And the few things in which I cannot participate, I never cared for much anyway. Yet I learned from a young age that blindness bothers many other people. I have heard of blindness described as a tragedy, a curse, a devastation, or a prison sentence. In population surveys, blindness is rated as one of the most feared diseases, surpassed only by cancer and AIDS. Much of my life has been spent on trying to understand how a condition that feels so normal and inconsequential to me would be so upsetting to outside observers.
Thank you, Arielle. I'm sharing some applause for your really beautiful writing, which we appreciate hearing. So you write in the book that when you were a baby and your ophthalmologist told your parents that there was no treatment for your condition, that was actually wonderful for you. I mean, looking back, it's wonderful. Can you explain what you meant, please?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So there are a lot of cases where people are born with disabilities and there's some hope of maybe possibly being able to medically treat a disability. And unfortunately, what often happens is parents and doctors with the best of intentions will do everything they can to try to reverse or, mitigate someone's disability through medical means. And unfortunately, in many of those cases, attempts at medical treatment don't work. So I'm grateful for the fact that a medical treatment wasn't even on the table when I was a baby, because my parents and my medical team didn't go through any of the process of trying to intervene to try to save my vision. So I'm 38 years old. I've never had surgery before. I've never been under anesthesia before. I've never even spent the night in the hospital before. Knock on wood, that's not going to happen for a while longer in my life. And not to say that people who have had medical intervention, that their lives are necessarily bad, but there's certainly a lot of trauma that can go along with medical attempts to try to get rid of a disability. And I know a lot of people who have suffered a lot of trauma from having surgeries at a very young age, or being hospitalized, or having invasive medical tests. And unfortunately, all too often, all that trauma is for nothing. The disability is not actually treatable. So I'm glad that nobody went on a wild goose chase to try to save my vision, because they knew that it just wouldn't be possible. And so instead, my family and my medical team focused on educating me, helping me grow, helping me develop alongside my peers.
Yeah, it sounds like in the book, like that your parents were really resilient and optimistic and very resourceful. Can you tell us a bit about your early education?
So I went through a program, and so I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and there is actually still is a nonprofit organization there called the Foundation for Blind Children. And many states have some sort of blindness agency that's run by the state, or some kind of private or nonprofit managed organization that provides services for blind children. And so there was a program where I received early intervention services, and actually all children in the United States are entitled to receive government funded early intervention services between birth and the age of 3. And then I transitioned from that to a preschool that was run by the Foundation for Blind Children. And that is where I learned Braille. That's where I received my first cane, my first real foundational blindness skills. And then after that, when I was 5, I transitioned from preschool to the public kindergarten in my home neighborhood. So from kindergarten onward, I was educated in public schools, public universities, sometimes receiving services so there were individuals who would transcribe all of my work into Braille so that I could read it, and sometimes assist with transcribing my Braille assignments back into print so that my teachers could read my work, making other adaptations to the curriculum so that I had full access to the curriculum. And starting in the late 1970s, there were laws passed that require that all children in the United States are educated in what's called the least restrictive environment, meaning that if they have disabilities, as much as is practical, they should be educated in their neighborhood schools alongside their peers without disabilities. If that's not possible, sometimes kids end up going to schools for the blind, other kinds of specialized environments. But to the greatest extent possible, kids are entitled to be educated alongside their peers without disabilities.
And you write about when you were in 4th grade, you had what you call an awakening. Can you explain what you meant by that and how that shaped your thinking and your outlook?
Yeah, so as I alluded to in the passage that I read, because I've been blind for my entire life, it never occurred to me that there was anything wrong with being blind. But I gradually, like all children, started to learn more about the world and about the attitudes of other people and how I was perceived by others. And I started to recognize, and it really was a gradual process that took several years, but in my memory, what really stood out is 4th grade as being a time when I really started to be awake or aware of the fact that a lot of people, consciously or not, saw me as less capable, less deserving of equal treatment because I was blind. And so before that, I had some awareness so I knew that I was blind. I knew the word. I knew that other people could do things that I couldn't do, like they could read print and they could play, sports with balls that made no sound and things like that. And I also started to recognize that sometimes kids spoke to me, or adults spoke to me in different ways than they spoke to other kids. They spoke to me in a different tone of voice, like kind of treated me like I was younger than I was, or said that I couldn't do certain things because they weren't safe. But I didn't put the two together. Like I was frustrated that people treated me differently, and I was frustrated that there were things I couldn't do that other people could do. But I didn't really put together the fact that the reason people were overprotective of me or didn't include me in things is because I was blind. And it was really around 4th grade that I put those things together, and I realized that people had these attitudes. And there were a couple of experiences that I wrote about in the book, like one on a school bus where I was very literally segregated from my peers and my friends, because the bus driver, with all good intentions, thought that I needed to be protected in the front of the bus in case there was an emergency and we had to get off the bus or whatever it may be. So he had the best of intentions, but of course the consequence is that I was segregated from my friends in a very real way. And so I had to contend with the fact that because of the characteristic that I was born with that I had no control over, people didn't always treat me as well as they treated my peers.
I don't know if it was 4th grade or maybe earlier, you write about, an early admiration of Martin Luther King Jr. and your earliest perceptions of race. Can you comment about that, please?
Yeah, so that was actually in 2nd grade when I first heard of Martin Luther King Jr. And I was in class and we were watching a video about, that of course tried to condense the whole civil rights movement into an hour. And it was the first time I'd ever heard of, that I can remember, that I'd ever heard of white people or Black people. And so, of course, I was hearing these stories about this group of people called Black people who were treated very badly in the South in the 1950s, and that there was, a Black woman named Rosa Parks who stood up for herself and for other Black people by defying the racial segregation on the bus. And then Martin Luther King Jr. and some of his colleagues were able to mount a resistance that actually succeeded in reversing a lot of the discriminatory laws against Black people. And of course, it was very simplified. But I walked away wondering why the Black people were being treated so poorly and whether I was a white person or a Black person. So I knew that my parents were alive in the 1950s and that they must have been either white people or Black people. And I knew that whatever they were, I probably also was the same. And so I was very curious about, as you know, any kid I would think would be curious about where they stand in this particular situation. And so I came home and I asked my mom, I think both of my parents were present and my whole family was together, and I asked whether I was Black or white. And there's a lot that happened that I don't remember all the details of, but what really stands out in memory is that there was this hesitation before I know my mom is here listening to this. There was this hesitation before she replied, and she did tell me that I was white. But there was, and she also said something to the effect of like, I'm just so touched that you didn't know the difference between white people and Black people, or something to that effect. It might not have been exactly those words. And of course I wrote about how, you know, even though it was helpful that I knew that I was white, I was still very confused because I didn't understand what the history was behind why the Black people were being treated so poorly. I didn't understand why I was white and why other people were Black. I didn't know that people's skin actually could look differently depending on their background. So those were things that, and kind of in the same vein as the awakening that I talked about in the last question, those were things that took time for me to really fully comprehend. And of course, there were aspects of racism that I didn't really know about or understand until I was in graduate school and I was learning about stereotyping and prejudice. And some things I actually didn't know until after I wrote the book. I didn't know what Juneteenth was until 2020 when I was in the middle of writing the book. And of course, much of that had to do with the fact that I grew up in a place that was very, very white. I'm sure probably 95% of the kids in that class in second grade that I was watching video with were also white kids. And so race was just, it didn't come up in conversation. It just wasn't an issue, you know, for better or for worse, it just never came up in conversation. So it was something that I had to learn about incidentally through, you know, through explicit lessons like that one, and also through incidental exposure. And so in that way, my experience was the same as that of my sighted peers who were white. But I also learned about it differently because I didn't have the exposure to skin color differences. So I had to learn about it through language and through science and through history. And I developed that knowledge in a different way than most people do.
Thanks, Arielle. So at the same time, you're also going to Hebrew school or Sunday school, and I wonder what that experience was like for you, and if you can also talk about how you know, Judaism has informed your life and your work.
Yeah, so I did go through the religious school. My family is members of Temple High in Scottsdale or in Phoenix, and we were very active in that community. I attended a lot of services, and of course had a lot of friends that I knew through school and through Hebrew school who were having bar bat mitzvahs, and then I had my own bat mitzvah, and so I went through the whole process. I think Judaism has definitely shaped a lot of my core values, and again, some of that education has been explicit by going to Hebrew school and Sunday school, and then later taking classes in high school related to Jewish values and Jewish ethics. So some of that has been explicit, some of it has been implicit just by watching my family and my friends who are Jewish and how they live their lives. I think the core value of justice and tikkun olam is definitely imprinted into me through my Jewish education. In terms of experiences with inclusion and exclusion in Jewish life, I think in many ways I was very well included in terms of the academic parts of attending religious school. There is an agency out of New York called Jewish Braille Institute that can transcribe Jewish materials into Braille. So I was able to access the teaching materials that I could learn Hebrew, and Hebrew Braille is actually easier to learn than Hebrew print is if you're an English speaker. The transition from English to Hebrew is easier in Braille. So I learned Hebrew Braille, and I had my bat mitzvah, and I was able to access all those materials without any difficulties. I think the challenge, I've talked about this in a couple other presentations, is that Jews are a minority in the world and in the United States, and blind people are also a minority. And so the intersection between those two groups is very, very small. And because those identities are both minorities, it can create a kind of perceived tension between the two. So I had kind of a group of friends, peers who were Jewish, who were sighted, and then I had a group of friends and peers who were blind, who were not Jewish. And so sometimes I think, particularly in my teen years, I felt kind of a tension between my Jewish identity and my blind identity, and particularly because I was an adolescent and I was trying to pull away and distinguish myself from my family. Sometimes I felt drawn to kind of distance myself from the Jewish identity and move closer to the blind identity. Now as an adult, I don't have that same kind of duality in my life. I see people as people, and I don't necessarily categorize people in the same ways. And I think because of the relationships that I have with blind peers that were very important for my identity development, it helped me to build confidence to also have strong relationships with sighted peers, including Jewish peers. I will say, like many American Jews, I'm not as religiously active as I was as a child. I'm not a member of a synagogue. My husband's not Jewish. I'm not necessarily active in this or observant in the same ways, but I certainly hold, I think, a lot of the values that I grew up with.
So it seems like community is an important theme in the book. And for you, I wonder like how you think now of the communities that you belong to and that sustain you.
Yeah, so I think there's several communities, and I was always a person who I was never drawn toward having a single group of friends. I like to have different friends and different connections from different parts of my life. And I enjoy when groups from different parts of my life come together. I would say currently, of course, I have relationships with family. I'm very close with my husband and his family. I still gain a lot of, the word is strength and affirmation from being connected with other people who are blind. And I think some of my blind friends might be here tonight. I've been a member of the National Federation of the Blind in 5 different states. And even though I've kind of gone back and forth on how I feel about some aspects of the organization, I always have kind of thrived on having connections with other members of the organization and knowing that whenever I move to a new place, there's always a built-in blind community. Because even though I'm in a place now where I can choose who I interact with, and I am working in a job where I'm supported as a blind person, there are still times when I face prejudice and stereotyping and discrimination. If I'm out on the street and someone comes up to me and starts talking to me like I'm a child, or they grab my arm and try to pull me somewhere, or they ask me in the airport if I'm traveling alone in kind of a condescending way, or if I can't access something because it's a website that my screen reader doesn't work well with. When I face those kinds of barriers, it's very affirming to be able to go on Facebook and post about my experience and be able to hear from other blind people that they've gone through the same things. It doesn't mean that and they reassure me that it's not personal when this person's condescending to you. It's not personal. It doesn't mean that you're incompetent. This is just the stereotypes that people have about blindness. And I offer that support to my blind peers as well. So I think the blind community is very important. You know, even though I'm not part of a synagogue, I think like pockets of Jewish community that I interact with, like I'm on the Federation's Inclusion Committee here in the DC area, and meeting people and having friendships with people who share my motivation to advocate and remove barriers in different ways is really important.
So you mentioned just now the National Federation for the Blind, but you were not only a member, but you actually rose to leadership positions right in this organization and perhaps others. I know that was important to you.
Yeah, so I think I wrote about being elected president of the National Association of Blind Students, and I did that for a couple of years. I currently hold some local leadership positions, and I've worked for youth programs in the organization. So I worked in different places in the organization.
Mm-hmm. What you use a term like inspiration porn. Can you explain what that means and how you might have encountered that?
Yeah, so that is not my term. There are a few terms in the book that I borrowed from other people who I greatly admire. I always cited people whose terms I borrowed, but inspiration porn was created by an Australian comedian with a physical disability named Stella Young. And she passed away when she was 32. She was born the same year that my sister was born. And she had this TED Talk that was internationally recognized that I think she published maybe a year or so before she died. And she talked about, so she made up the term inspiration porn. And from what she said, the reason she called it inspiration porn is because it's when people talk about people with disabilities and how inspiring we are, but they present it in a way that's for their own benefit or their own gratification. So it kind of objectifies people with disabilities for the benefit of people without disabilities, just like pornography can objectify, you know, the people participating in it for the benefit of people viewing it. So what is inspiration porn? It can be just any kind of expression or depiction of someone with a disability where they're being praised or labeled as inspiring or amazing for doing things that are pretty ordinary. So she talked about her life. She was a wheelchair user, and she talked about being, you know, pretty typical teenager, getting average grades. You know, she didn't do a lot of extracurricular activities. She liked to watch Dawson's Creek on the weekends, and, you know, was a very average teenager. And yet she was given some kind of award in front of her peers because she was a girl with a disability who was in a public school. And sometimes that can happen where, and I wrote about experiences I had where sometimes I did do something that might have been award worthy, but it was the recognition that I got was way over the top, or it was more than the recognition given to a peer who did the exact same thing, who happened to not be blind. And there are several reasons why this inspiration porn, even though it's not necessarily intentionally meant to objectify people with disabilities or make us feel bad. It's often meant to make us feel good. But it can have a couple of issues. One being that, again, there's the objectification and kind of othering. So people with disabilities are seen as special, different, you know, amazing, not like us. But also I wrote about this idea of shifted standards. So when someone says, wow, what you did was so amazing, all too often it comes from this hidden perspective of it's really amazing for the blind girl or for a woman or for a person with a disability, not just being amazing in its own right. And so sometimes when somebody says you're so inspiring, it's kind of a symptom of a bigger problem, which is that they don't necessarily expect the same level of performance because the person has a disability.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about these? There are like programs that try to give sighted people a sense of what it's like to be blind. There's like something called Dining in the Dark. And I know some people probably on the Zoom have visited this restaurant in Tel Aviv that where all this, you're eating in the dark and all the servers are blind. How do you feel about those experiences?
So I was intrigued as a graduate student to try to understand those experiences, because it was one thing that people without disabilities love to do, and yet a lot of people with disabilities hate. So it presented an interesting test case for something that, again, is, you know, done with the best of intentions, and yet the impact is different from the intent. And so I did some research as a graduate student to try to figure out why these disability simulations, you know, whether my hypothesis was correct, that these disability simulations could actually backfire. And to make a long story short, when we did experiments where we actually blindfolded people and had them do things in the dark or blindfolded, and then we had them answer questions about what it's like to be blind, we found that when people were blindfolded, they had more negative attitudes. They expected less of people who are blind. They thought that they would be more impaired. They thought that blind people would be less able to perform activities related to employment or independent living, which can be very damaging and discriminatory. I mean, those kinds of beliefs are what lead to a lot of blind people not being hired for certain jobs because employers believe they can't do those jobs. And so in examining why those simulations can be counterproductive, it's important to remember that when you've had an experience, it's impossible to know what it's like to have never had that experience. So it's impossible to imagine. You can imagine being the other gender and maybe even simulate it, but it's impossible to really know what it's like to have never been a person of your gender, because you have a lifetime of experience being a man or being a woman or being another gender. So you can't simulate what it's like to be a different gender in any meaningful way. And by the same token, if you've had sight your entire life, you cannot possibly know what it's like to have never had sight before, because you would have to forget everything you ever knew about being sighted. The other issue is that when people become disabled and they're permanently disabled, they adapt and they learn skills and they problem solve. And certain things get a lot easier when you've been disabled for a while that are really, really hard when you first become disabled. And conversely, some things get harder. There are some problems related to disability that take time to manifest. But when someone does a simulation, they really only experience like the first little half hour, an hour, or 2 hours of becoming disabled. And so certain issues will seem bigger than they actually are, and then other issues will seem not as significant as they actually are. And it can create a really biased perception of what it's like to have the disability. And so I don't know if this is the next question, but people always ask me, well, if I can't do a simulation, what do I do instead? And I would say, you know, it's important to examine the purpose of the activity and what the learning goals are, and to ensure that those goals align with the actual perspectives of people living with those disabilities. And then if a simulation is done in a way that emphasizes the issues that are actually real issues for people with those disabilities, they can be beneficial. So for example, if someone does a simulation where they are in a wheelchair and they try to navigate an area that's very inaccessible, and then they try to navigate an analogous area that is much more accessible, the lesson that's being taught is not that it's horrible to be in a wheelchair. The lesson that's being taught is that the environment makes a big difference, and here are some ways to ensure that environments are accessible for wheelchair users. So there are ways to tweak the simulations so that the right pedagogical goals are being met, or to use a different strategy besides simulations, like doing a cooperative activity where people with disabilities are leading or are participating alongside people without disabilities, so that people learn what those adaptive strategies are and how to be helpful.
Great. Thank you. I know we're jumping around a bit, but I have so many questions I want to ask you. Related to that, can you tell us about, I know you went to a training program in Louisiana where you say actually you learned how to learn. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah,
You know,
so most states have some kind of adult training program for blind adults, but there's a few centers across the country that are a little bit different. And so I went to this center in Louisiana where most of the staff were blind. And if they were not blind, they had been taught extensively under blindfold how to do things while blind. And they follow this philosophy called structured discovery. And if you think about it, structured discovery is part of how everyone learns. When we learn as children, we learn by doing, observing and doing and messing up and figuring out how to fix our mistakes. And so it was the same philosophy at this center. And so it wasn't like they just turned us to the wolves. Like there was a structured component to where we were taught some skills, but a lot of the lessons consisted of having us in, a controlled way, problem solve and learn by doing how to do things. So for example, I wrote about one of the classes that I had was called cane travel. And so I knew how to use a white cane to be able to get around, and I could get around in familiar areas pretty well by the time I went to the center, but I didn't really know how to discover unfamiliar areas. So with the instructors, they would teach us some about the layout of the town where we were living, and they would teach us some foundational skills, about how to know what direction you were walking in based on the sun, how to cross streets safely, those kinds of skills that have to be taught explicitly. But then they would give us assignments where they would give us an address and they would say, go to this, and they wouldn't tell us what was at this address. They would just say, go to this address, get a business card and bring it back. And so I would have to use, what knowledge I had of the layout of the town and how the streets were ordered in order to get close to the address that I was trying to find. And then I had to ask questions and get information from passersby on the street or walking into the business and asking someone in the business what address it was in order to identify the right address. Which of course, a sighted person who's going to an address doesn't have to do all that because they get a lot of clues from signs and maps and those kinds of tools that blind people can't fully access. So we have to fill in the gaps by asking questions or by being really attuned to our environment and the information that we do have. And it was hard. And there were some times where my routes took a couple of hours. There were some times where I got, way off base and had to find my way back. It was hard work, but in the end, I learned that it was okay if I got off course. I didn't need to worry. I didn't need to panic. I just needed to use my skills and be aware of my environment and ask the right questions and be able to find my way back. And there are definitely times now when knowing those address search skills is really helpful. And then there were other classes I took that were similar in that we would get some basic instruction, but a lot of what we did to complete tasks involved problem solving, trial and error, and making mistakes and being okay with making mistakes.
Thanks. Just want to pause for a moment and remind everybody that if you have questions to please put them in the chat. And also in the chat is some information on where to get Arielle's book, but the book comes in a number of formats. Can you just explain that in addition to this version, how people might be able to access the book?
Yeah, so Amazon is probably the quickest way to get the book if you want a paperback or the Kindle edition. And I think that's the link that was shared. There are a couple of other formats that you can buy from me directly. One of them is a PDF. So if you want a digital copy of the book, but you don't use Kindle or you don't want to give Amazon your money, I'll take your money. It's $4.99. It's the same price as the Kindle and you'll get a PDF. There is also an audio version that I recorded myself. And so it's not going to be, the absolute highest quality audio, but there are some little surprises in there. a few voice clips in there and some music and some kind of fun little surprises in there. That audiobook is the same price as the paperback, so it's $15. And you can purchase the audio or the PDF or the Braille version, which I'll talk about in a second, by sending me payment through Venmo, PayPal, or Zelle. And if you go to my website, the email address for all three of those payment methods is the same, and it's on my website. I can also have someone put it in the chat. It's arielle71@gmail.com, and you just send payment there. $4.95 or $4.99 for the PDF, $15 for the audio, and then the Braille. If you want a hard copy Braille version, that the price for that is $25. So you would need to tell me, you would need to send me the payment the same way, and then you would need to tell me where you want the Braille books to be shipped so that I can have my transcriber fulfill that order. There is also a digital Braille version. If you know someone, if you yourself or you know someone who has like a Braille note or an Orbit reader or some kind of device that reads .brl format, there is a version of the book in .brl format, and that again is the same price as the other digital editions, $4.99.
Great. Thanks, Arielle. Thank you very much. I want to get on to talk about some of the consulting work that you do these days or that you've done. Maybe you can start with telling us about how you were involved with the union, the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism.
Yeah, so that was a referral through my mother. Thanks, Mom. So I had just started my postdoc, and I had published this dissertation work related to disability simulations. And I think my mom had gone to a conference or something and had met up with someone who does inclusion work with the Union for Reform Judaism. And she reached out to me, and they were working on, so this was about 8 or 9 years ago, and they were working on creating this Disabilities Inclusion Learning Center. And I believe it's still active. That can also be found, that link can also be found on my website. So I was asked to provide a couple of webinars about inclusion, and I ended up creating 2 webinars. One was about this identity issue that I talked about earlier between the Jewish identity and the blind identity and balancing those two. The other one was about the disability simulation work, so explaining why disability simulations aren't always the greatest idea for educating people about disabilities, and then offering some alternatives. And in that webinar is when I really introduced this disability wisdom philosophy. And the term disability wisdom actually has 2 meanings. So one is just this idea that people with disabilities have wisdom about our own experiences, and instead of having other people speak for us, we should be the ones who are consulted about our experiences. But the term wisdom was also comes from the term wise that was used by the sociologist Irving Goffman to talk about how people should treat those who have stigmatized characteristics. So when we talk about allyship, the concept of allyship is very similar to the concept of the wise person that Goffman wrote about in his book. So these principles of disability wisdom have shaped a lot of the webinars and presentations that I've done over the years, starting off with that URJ webinar. And those 3 principles, which are in the book, are, when you interact with someone who has a disability or any kind of difference, you should acknowledge their full humanity. You should treat them like an ordinary other. So like basically treat them in almost all ways the same way as you would someone without a disability, and then treat them as an expert on their own needs. So if you aren't sure if they need help or accommodation or the best way to accommodate them, just ask them.
Thanks. And you've also done some work for the Federation for Jewish Camping. But also tell us about your own experience with Jewish camps.
Yeah, so my own experience with Jewish camps is fairly limited because I didn't get to go to Jewish camp. There was a camp in my state that my sister went to, and a lot of my friends went to, and I was told that I wasn't allowed to go. Of course, I don't know exactly all the back and forth that happened. I think there were maybe some liability concerns or some questions about how much support I would need and whether they could afford it and that sort of thing. Of course, that was in the mid 1990s when I was of the age where I would have wanted to go to camp. I did go to some like kind of weekend retreat type activities and some youth activities for shorter periods of time, including a couple that were located at the camp site, but I didn't actually get to go to a full session of Jewish camp. I did work with Foundation for Jewish Camp for a few years. That was a referral, so that they were my second client. URJ was my first client, and then they referred me to FJC, and they were my second client. And I did some consulting with them on some guide materials that they were creating about disabilities, where I brought in some feedback from people with disabilities, including some autistic people that I consulted with on terminology, and worked with them a little bit on some of their simulation-based activities and helping them revamp and modify those activities to be more disability affirming. I did also present a workshop at one of the FJC biennial conference, or actually two of the FJC biennial conferences related to inclusion. And again, this issue of how do you educate staff who might not have any experience with disabilities in a way that's affirming toward people with disabilities.
So I wonder if you can help us with some specifics. Someone is asking, when shuls strive to be inclusive and welcoming to all, what guidance can you give to assure that blind individuals are included and that their needs are met?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think there's some complexity, and that's where it's really important to consult with, if there are specific blind individuals in the community or who are thinking about joining the community, to consult with them on their preferences, because there are some blind people who read Braille. There are a lot of blind people who don't read Braille, either because they learned it later in life, or they've just decided to use other means to access information, or they have usable vision. Some people read our large print. They identify as blind, but they have enough vision they can read large print. Some people read using audio, or they use a screen reader on their phone to be able to access information. I think one thing that you can do that's really simple that will help everyone without having to consult individual blind people is make sure that all of your digital communications, like emails and website content, is optimized for use with screen readers. And so there is a guidance system called WCAG, Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines, and they have some online materials that web developers can look at to be in checklists to make sure that your website is compliant. And WCAG deals with all types of disabilities, but many of those guidelines are blindness related. So for example, if you have pictures on your website, it's important to be sure that they have alternative text or alt text included. If you have pictures in your newsletters, you need to make sure that they're described. Some people recommend that you use alt text and then you also write a description in like the caption box. So you want to be sure that your captions are really descriptive. You want to be sure that all the links on your website are properly labeled. And I mean, this is kind of getting into IT technical land, but make sure that your web developer looks at the checklist and ensures that your website and all your content is compliant for blind people. And that will really help a blind person who's maybe just browsing and trying to decide if they want to join your shul feel welcome, if they can actually access everything on your website.
Thanks, Arielle. I wonder in what ways, you mentioned a lot of technology. In what ways has this sort of improving technology changed your, your life and in so many ways?
Yeah, so I think millennials, I'm a millennial, and I think millennials are in an interesting spot because we remember a little bit of life without internet, but not a whole lot. I certainly don't remember life without a computer. I was using a computer from starting when I was in first grade. So I feel like I've always had a computer. And I've always had I mean, starting in first grade, I've had access to some sort of screen reading technology. There's certainly been a lot of innovations over the last 30 years in the technology becoming more portable, being able to do more things. So there is technology now that can read print and digitize print. You can take a picture of a page of print and it'll read it back to you, which is pretty cool, and certainly wasn't. It existed in the 1990s, but you had to use like a flatbed scanner to access print. And now you can access print with your iPhone. So that's a pretty cool innovation. There are now also services where you can basically FaceTime call or video call with a sighted person who works for the service, who can provide visual description of your surroundings and access to websites and things like that that are inaccessible. So technology has certainly made a lot of improvements. Unfortunately, as we've become more dependent on digital information, there are still a lot of gaps in terms of accessibility. So for example, college students, maybe in the 80s and 90s, or even before, if they wanted to access their textbooks, they could hire someone to read it to them. And that's still an option. But they could also like send the textbook somewhere to be brailled. And now all the textbooks are in these digital formats that are locked, that can't necessarily be converted easily into braille or into an inaccessible digital format. And so if those digital formats were not created with blind people in mind, blind people can be left out sometimes in ways even worse than how they were left out before digital books were a thing. So like I say, technology is often like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Like overall things are getting easier, but there's definitely barriers and there's definitely new issues that come up that are created by technology that we all need to be vigilant about correcting those issues.
Thanks. I have a lot more questions. I'm going to just switch to some of the questions that people are sending in. So this is a long one. I'm going to read your opening remarks touching on your being born blind and others whose families may have tried medical interventions reminded me of a comment in Andrew Solomon's Far from the Tree. He quotes a man with what used to be called autism who said in effect, quote, "When you," meaning my parents and others' parents, "say they wish to pray for a cure for autism, what they are really is saying, quote, I wish you were someone else, not the child I have. You are trying to find a better or different child behind the face or person I really am. You may mean well, but I hear you saying you don't want my authentic self, but one that meets your wishes or expectations." And now back to the question is, I wonder if you, Arielle, have any thoughts about perspective or idea. And thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, that idea resonates with me very, very much. It is very hard for me to read or hear about parents being disappointed that their child has a disability, particularly when they're born with a disability. And this is something that I address in the book. And the person who asked the question, I don't know if they've read the book. If you haven't, I think you might resonate with a lot of what I expressed in the book. And it's hard because I try to support parents. I interact sometimes online with parents and I want to be a resource for parents. And emotionally, it can be exhausting to, hear parents say that they're disappointed because their kid was born with a disability. And so part of what I address in the book is why people are disappointed, but more importantly, why people are surprised when they find out that their child has a disability and they say, well, I didn't expect this. I expected something different. And in the end, I don't blame the parents. I blame society, because society has taught us that we should expect to have kids without disabilities. And disability is unfortunately often just kind of pushed under the rug. And people have these expectations that just kind of implicitly include a lack of disability. And then when they have a child and they find out that there's a disability, they're just shocked. And I think that's the issue that I want to address head on. And so I write about, like, wouldn't it be great if we all recognize the fact that when someone is pregnant or expecting a child, there's a 1 in 4 chance that this baby will either have a disability when they're born, or in most cases, they will get a disability at some point in their life. But it's okay, because they will find a community that accepts them, and they will learn the skills and the adaptations. And of course, they will have challenges, and some people with disabilities have more challenges than others, or challenges that are easier or harder to accommodate in the world. But can we be okay with that possibility, instead of kind of denying that and saying it won't happen to me, and then when it does happen, being devastated by it?
Yeah. Your book, Arielle, makes us realize that, disability is a different way of being. And I think that's such an important point. Here's a very different question. Someone is wondering if you would share how you met your husband.
Yeah. Well, it's in the book, so you should read the book. Short version is, when I started my graduate program at the University of Colorado, there were 2 students in my year. There was me and there was my husband. And because we were in the same year, we were in close proximity to each other. We shared an office, and we were in the same classes all the way through. And so the first year or so, we were just kind of friends and classmates, and we would talk about class and research and stuff like that. But then we started spending some time together outside of school, because the program was doing things like with bringing in new students and having social activities and things like that. And so we started interacting a little bit outside of school. And then, I don't want to give too much away, but when you spend a lot of time with someone, sometimes feelings can happen, and it was the right time for both of us. And after we started dating, we realized that we actually had a lot in common, and had a lot of compatibility. And the only other thing I guess I'll say right here is that my husband is sighted, and people definitely have questions about, should someone with a disability marry someone else with a disability, or should they marry someone who doesn't have a disability, who can help them and take care of them? And people on both sides of the issue have stereotypes about it. Sometimes if I'm out with a male friend who's blind, people think he's my husband, or people think my husband is not my husband because he's not blind. So people have stereotypes. And then, on the other side, people might assume that I should be with someone sighted. But really, at the end of the day, it's all a question of who you're most compatible with and who you love. And it doesn't matter if the person has a disability or not. There are certainly dynamics that are different if you're dating someone who has a disability, who shares your disability, or who doesn't. But at the end of the day, it's really just about who you love.
Mm-hmm. In the book, there's actually a beautiful description of your wedding in Colorado, and your childhood rabbi flying in, who was from Phoenix and flying in from Israel to do the wedding. And you have a really special ketubah. Can you tell us about the ketubah?
Yeah, it's actually behind me. I wonder if I can show it off here. I don't know if this is going to work, but I'll see. Yeah, it's right here.
I think we can see it, Arielle.
Yeah, I just clicked on something, but I guess that's fine. Yeah, so this is actually a wooden ketubah that my husband's mother, Jason's mother, made for us. And because she's an artist and she does wood burning. And I remember she suggested it, and I thought that was the weirdest thing I'd ever heard of, but we love it. So it has, on one side, it has a tree of life, and on the other side it has Celtic knotwork, because that's my husband's Welsh heritage is represented. And then it has, the English of the ketubah is written on there. And then at the very bottom, it says and I'm just so impressed that my mother-in-law was able to do this, because she literally only just had a picture of the Braille. That we emailed her a photo of Hebrew Braille that says Ani Dodi Vadodi Li, and it's abbreviated in Braille to Ani Dodi Li. And I can actually read it, which a lot of times when people try to Braille things on like wood or plastic, the Braille is impossible to read, but like I can actually read this. So it's really incredible what she did.
It's beautiful. Thank you for showing to us. Appreciate that. So one last thing that I didn't get to, I wonder if you could tell us, I know you're very committed to mentoring young people. Maybe you can tell us about the kinds of work that you've done over the years and what you're doing now, helping younger blind folks.
Yeah, so I worked for a program in Virginia called Project Rise for about 4.5 years. So when I wrote the book, I was still working there. And so there was a law that was passed about 9 years ago that designates a pot of money from the federal government that must be spent on what's called pre-employment transition services. So these are services that are helping high school and college students with disabilities get ready for employment. And so after that money was designated, a whole bunch of states started putting together programs to take advantage of those funds. And Project Rise was specifically set up for high school and college students who are blind or have low vision. And this program, like kind of the core of the program, is based on mentorship. And I was actually working as like one of the assistant coordinators. So I was doing a lot of behind the scenes work, like arranging, some of the financial aspects of the program, managing data and administrative activities related to the program. But I also got to work with students, helping them find work experiences, or in some cases, setting up work experiences for students, helping them with informational interviews where they would actually meet blind people who were doing the type of job that they were interested in exploring, doing as a career. And a lot of that, of course, could be facilitated virtually. So when COVID happened, we just did virtual informational interviews, and we were able to pivot that way. And we would also have these when we were in person, we'd have these weekend retreats where the students would sometimes interact with older students and young professionals who would mentor them. And now I've actually recently just started working for a kind of similar program in Michigan, just part-time as a mentor for a few high school students, where they actually have a virtual work experience running an online store for about 2 months. And so they get assigned different tasks. Some of them will be doing the accounting, some of them will be doing marketing. They get assigned to different parts of the store, and they actually get paid and sell a real product. So I'm very curious to see how that will happen. And it's really been fulfilling to work with these students, to watch them grow up. I had a student recently celebrate his 21st birthday, and I met him just before his 16th birthday. So it was really nice to be able to wish him happy birthday and say congratulations, you could have a beer. And, he told me that I had made a big impact on his life. And, that work can be hard sometimes, but it's also very rewarding.
That's great. Thank you. So I'm again holding up the jacket of the book, and I know there's a story behind the design of the jacket. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about, as a blind person, and I wasn't sure how this was going to work out. Like, how would I come up with a cover design for my book? Because I've been very controlling over basically all of my book. I self-published because I didn't want to have to change any of the content, and hired my own freelancers to make the book happen. And so I guess kind of backing up a little bit. So one of the students that I supported when I was working for the Project Rise program, he goes by Liam in the book, and I became very close with this student. Unfortunately, he's had a lot of hard things in his life. But he was also brought a lot of joy. He was, 95% of the time he was smiling and laughing and, just full of joy and loved to be in the program. And he did an internship that I set up for him at a music store. And he has a very strong interest, a special interest related to electronic dance music. And he also has low vision, and he really enjoyed looking at like strobe lights and, designing these like light displays that would go along with the electronic dance songs that he liked. So his like final project for his internship was to create this show for about an hour. There was like this dance show, and about 25 people came, and they were all dancing, and there were all these lights all over the different colored lights all over the place. And it was just like, it was just such an incredible experience to be present for and to watch his confidence and, being a DJ and getting to do this thing that he loves so much, especially given all the stuff happening in his family life and related to his education and things like that. So when I was thinking about, and the other thing is that when I was writing the book, we were talking on Zoom a lot, and I was telling him a lot about my progress with the book, and I asked him if he wanted to be in it, and he said he did. And so we talked a lot about the book, and unfortunately, because of some of the family issues, I haven't heard from him in about 2 years. But he always had this desire to like want to make life better for other people, for other young people. So when I was working on the cover design, I was thinking about these different ideas, and I kept coming back to this like dancing lights concept, because I was thinking about this light show and how awesome it was, and thinking about him, and I was thinking about this idea that like a book about a blind person, people associate blindness with darkness. Like, wouldn't it be cool instead to have these lights? And so I hired this cover designer, and we went through 3 rounds of development for the cover design. So I told her, I had this idea about the dancing lights, and then she came up with a couple of options, and I would crowdsource because I couldn't see them. So I would crowdsource them on Facebook. And I created, like, I'm a researcher, so I created a little research questionnaire where they would rate the covers, and I, did statistical analysis on the ratings and blah, blah, blah. And so like the first round of designs were not that good. They were okay. The scores were in the middle. And then in the second round, the designer added an image, like a stock photo of a person. And we had talked about whether my picture should be on the cover, and we all agreed that I should not appear on the cover because, first of all, there's pictures of me in the interior of the book, but also, even though the book is about me, it's not for me. It's for people I haven't met yet, young people, parents, teachers, educators, people who can learn from the book. So I didn't want it to be me, but they had this picture of a person, and I was getting more feedback on a couple of different options, like the different pictures, different stock photos that were on the cover. And at some point, somebody suggested that maybe the stock photo should be gender ambiguous, like not necessarily male or female, just kind of gender ambiguous. And then, so I started thinking again about the student, this male student that I had. And I remember that he and I both have like actually kind of similar haircuts, like our, shoulder length curly hair. People have commented his hair is being long for a guy, and my hair is a little short for a woman. And at one point we were standing next to each other, and somebody had made a comment about our hair being similar. And so I emailed the cover designer, and I told her the whole story about the light show and about the student that I had. And I was like, I wonder if there's a way we could find a picture of someone who has curly hair, who's doesn't look like either of us, but who's gender ambiguous. And I did also show her a video from the light show. And from that, she was able to actually add in some additional color gradients to resemble some of the lights from the light show. And then she identified an image of a person, kind of a young adult person wearing a beanie, who was, and I think they are actually lit up in the back by a window. And so that's the story of the cover design. And
It's a beautiful cover.
it started out being pretty lackluster from what people told me. And by the end, everybody was like in love with it. And so, I mean, it just goes to show that even when you're totally blind, if you judiciously, trust and feedback from people you trust and hire someone who's skilled at putting your vision into action, you can create something really great.
Yeah, it really is great. Arielle, I think we're about to wind down, but I just wonder if there's anything that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share with us?
I don't think so. I want to make sure I'm not ignoring anyone who wrote something in the chat. I think someone had asked about whether I had a paraprofessional in school or something like that. Is that comment?
Yes,
still in
that
there?
was an early question. If you had a paraprofessional with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was assigned someone in kindergarten and first grade, and then that person was phased out. And I think that was a great thing. Because again, it comes back to the problem solving. Like, I didn't have someone babysitting me or sitting next to me all the time in class. So I had to learn how to get the information that I needed. And of course, that's how life is. If I'm out in the world, I don't have someone shadowing me. Nowadays, my understanding is that paraprofessionals are a lot more, for blind students, are a lot more common than they were in my generation. And I think that's unfortunate. I understand that cases are individual, and there are some cases where the best support, if somebody really does need that kind of support and can benefit from that kind of support. But unfortunately, I think part of the reason for that is that there's really a crisis. We don't have enough qualified teachers of the blind. The teachers that we do have are very overextended, and especially with the pandemic, people have been dropping out of the field. We aren't recruiting enough teachers. It's a huge problem in this country. And so the paraprofessionals are kind of like filling in the gaps that really should be filled in by qualified teachers. So I hope that sometime in the future, there will come a point where we will actually have enough teachers, and then the teachers can teach the skills and then step away and let the students use those skills on their own.
Sounds like you had one very special teacher, Mrs. Gersh.
Yeah.
She sounds really wonderful. Toby, are you raising your hand? You need to unmute.
Unmute.
Maybe send an unmute request.
Okay. In the meantime, Arielle, I see there's one other question.
So here I am unmuted.
Okay.
I want to make a comment, and then I want to really thank Arielle. And the comment that I want to make is that it has to do with paraprofessionals. I worked as a school psychologist, and I totally agree with you that having too many aides and paraprofessionals, it really hurts children because they have learned helplessness. They rely on somebody else to be there. And parents would often fight for it, thinking that if a child had blind, whatever the issue, learning disability or a decoding issue, that if there was somebody next to them the whole time, that it would be helpful, but actually it really hampered the child from learning as much as they could. And there needs to be a rethinking of that. But aside from that, I see Lisa just put a similar comment in. I really wanted to thank you so much for sharing your experience, your wisdom. I read your book, and honestly, I have to be a little careful. This is not inspirational porn, because the book has so much wisdom in it, and shows so much strength on your part that anyone reading that book, it would be really a wonderful lesson in how to live a life. So thank you.
So,
Thank you so much.
Yes.
I
I really love the term disability wisdom. Is
Right.
it okay if I borrow it and attribute it to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not trademarked.
Should be. Everybody talks about lived experience, but I like disability wisdom.
Yep.
So before we sign off, I just want a few thanks to Abby Rosenfinkel for all of her work behind the scenes, and to Toby Glick and Lisa and all the members of the Inclusion Committee for making this event possible. And to our interpreter, Marianne Brown, thank you very much. And thank you so much, Arielle, for being with us and teaching us so much, and for all that you do to make the world, a better place for everyone.
And,
Again, I
and thank
encourage
you,
everyone.
Sandy. Thank you, Sandy, so much for living so close to Arielle, for your excellent questions, and for making our evening so educational and interesting, as always. Thank you, Sandy.
Great. I hope that we can incorporate some of your suggestions at our synagogue, Arielle.
Right.
And I wish you much continued success. And thank you all for joining us, and have a good evening. Stay well.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
Thanks for stopping by.
Arielle, you're great. So articulate. That was so interesting. Really, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Really, it was
For
fantastic.
sharing all the information, all the book information.
Bye, Arielle. I'll talk to you